can still smell that morning in the Ardennes like it's trapped inside me, the bitter sting of frost in the air, the heavy rot of damp earth, and the faint sweetness of pine needles crushed under 1,000 boots. December 16th, 1944. They told us it was a quiet sector, a place to breathe after the hell of Hurtgen. We were supposed to rest, lick our wounds, clean our rifle, maybe even dream a little about home. Instead, the war came for us again, this time cloaked in snow and silence. The sky was grey and low, pressing down on the forest until it felt like we were buried alive beneath it. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked, that soft white silence, before it all exploded. The first artillery rounds came at dawn, ripping through the trees with a sound that didn't belong to this earth. The ground shook, trees splintered, and the snow turned black where the shells hit. Jennings screamed something, maybe my name, maybe God's. I hit the ground so hard the air left my chest, and when I lifted my head, I saw fire pouring from the tree line like the woods themselves were bleeding. The smell of cordite, diesel, and burning pine filled my lungs, and for a second, I forgot to breathe at all. When the barrage stopped, the silence that followed was worse. It wasn't peace, it was waiting. You could feel it crawling over your skin, that sense that something monstrous was moving toward you just out of sight. Our radios were dead, our wires cut, our officers shouting orders that disappeared into the smoke. Somewhere north, the 106th had vanished, 2 entire regiments gone in a single day. We didn't know it then, but the Germans had thrown everything they had at us. Tanks painted white, men disguised in American uniform, whole divisions pushing through the snow like ghosts. We were under-equipped, underfed, and half-frozen. But when our general arrived that night, he looked at us as if we were the last wall standing between the enemy and the heart of Europe. He was a small man, older, with eyes that didn't blink much, calm voice, calm hands, the kind of calm that makes you realize panic is useless. He spread a map over a table lit by one trembling lantern. I remember his words exactly. They're coming for this road. If they get it, they'll cut our lifeline in 2. We hold here, no matter the cost. Someone asked how long until reinforcements came. He said, long enough for us to make this matter. Then he called his plan a risk. A quiet risk, he said, but the kind that changes everything if it works. That night, the snow fell heavier. We dug until our hands bled, the shovels hitting frozen ground like metal on bone, the foxholes filled with water, then ice. The men cursed, prayed, sang low songs just to keep their minds steady. I remember sitting in my hole, rifle across my knees, staring at the faint glow of Bastogne in the distance. Somewhere beyond that light were tanks, German panzers, grinding their way through villages with engines that sounded like rolling thunder. Every vibration through the ground felt like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. Jennings passed me a cigarette, and we smoked in silence, the smoke rising like ghosts of all the boys who'd already gone. I tried to picture home, my father's porch light, my mother's laugh echoing through the kitchen, the smell of her apple pie cooling on the window ledge, but it all felt far away, like it belonged to someone else. The frost was creeping into my gloves, and I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. I looked up at the sky and whispered a promise, not a prayer, just a stubborn little promise, that I'd see that porch light again. When dawn came, the fog was so thick we could barely see 10 feet ahead. Somewhere out there, beyond that white curtain, the enemy was moving. The general's plan was simple but brutal. Dig in, hold the line, don't break. He called it a risk, but we all knew what it meant. He was asking us to stand our ground until help came, even if that meant dying where we stood. But somehow, the way he said it made it feel like we could do it. Maybe it was his voice, or maybe it was because none of us had anything left but faith in each other. That's what war does. It burns away everything unnecessary until all you have is the man beside you. And as I watched Jennings humming an old swing tune while loading his rifle, I realized something that's hard to explain. Fear doesn't vanish in war. It just becomes another thing you carry, like your pack, your weapon, your memories. You carry it, and you move anyway. Before I tell you how that risk turned into the fight that nearly broke us, and how that same plan ended up saving our lives, tell me one thing before we go deeper. Where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments below. I want to know how far these old stories still travel. By the second day, the forest had become a graveyard, wrapped in silence. Every branch hung heavy with, and every foxhole was a coffin waiting its turn. We'd been awake for nearly 40 hours, eyes bloodshot, hands cracked and bleeding, and stomachs empty except for the bitter taste of powdered coffee and fear. The snow came in waves, blinding us, erasing everything but the pale outlines of men who no longer looked human. I remember looking around at the faces in my squad, Jennings, Miller, and that kid from Oklahoma, Peters, and realizing how young they really were. Peters had just turned 19, though his face already looked like someone twice that age. He kept rubbing a photo of his little sister over and over, like it was a charm that could keep him alive. Jennings had stopped joking by then. His eyes had sunk deep, and the smile he always wore had frozen somewhere between his teeth and his soul. Every man around me was shrinking, pulled tighter by the cold and the waiting. We could hear movement in the trees sometimes, metal on snow, a cough carried by the wind, things that told us the Germans were close, watching, waiting for the moment we'd crack. But we didn't. We held, because that was the order, and because we had nothing else to hold on to. When the general came back that evening, his face was grey from exhaustion, but his voice was steady. He told us the situation was worse than we knew. The Krauts had broken through everywhere, north, south, all across the Ardennes. The 101st was surrounded, Patton was still miles away, and Bastogne was becoming a pocket of fire and blood. He said our stand wasn't just about a road anymore, it was the only thing keeping the enemy from splitting the front in half. He didn't sugarcoat it, he didn't promise survival, he just said, if we fall, others die. If we hold, we make history. I didn't know if that meant anything then. We weren't thinking about history, we were thinking about how to survive the next hour. But later that night, as I watched him walking through the snow, stopping to speak quietly with every man he passed, I realized what kind of leader he was. He carried the weight for all of us. He looked like a man who'd already seen the end and decided to walk straight into it anyway. That night, the bombardment started again, heavier than before. The shells came from somewhere deep in the forest, their whistles cutting through the fog like razors. We dove for cover as the earth shook, the snow bursting upward in geysers of fire and mud. I felt the ground lift under me, then crash down again. My helmet rang like a bell, and when I opened my eyes, I saw Miller's body a few feet away, motionless, half buried in the snow. I crawled to him, grabbed his coat, shouted his name. Nothing. His eyes were open, staring at the sky. The snow was falling into them, and for a second it looked like he was blinking. I closed them with my hand and just sat there, numb. The shells kept coming, but I couldn't move. You'd think death would get easier when you see enough of it, but it doesn't. It builds up inside you, layer by layer, until it starts to drown whatever part of you used to be human. When the shelling stopped, I realized my rifle was gone. I found it under the snow, frozen solid, the metal biting into my palms. I wiped it off and whispered, one more day, just one more. When dawn came again, there were fewer of us. Jennings and I took turns watching the road, though there wasn't much to see, just fog and the occasional flicker of movement that might have been enemy scouts, or maybe just our minds cracking under the strain. Food was running out, ammo was low, and the medics had nothing left but morphine and bandages that froze stiff. The general's risk was now our world. Every breath we took was inside that gamble, and somehow, knowing we were already beyond rescue, made us fight harder. There's a strange kind of strength that comes when you stop believing in luck. You fight for each other, not for the war, not for the flag, just for the man who's still breathing next to you. That night, Jennings looked at me and said, "You think he was right, the general, about this plan saving us?" I wanted to lie to him, to say yes, but the truth was frozen somewhere behind my teeth. So I just nodded, and maybe, for that moment it was enough, because belief, even when it's hollow, can be the only thing that keeps you alive out there. If you've made it this far into the story, I want you to pause for a second, take a breath. Think about what it means to stand your ground when every instinct tells you to run. That's what war really is. Not glory, not medals, just holding on when everything inside you screams to let go. And if you believe stories like this should still be told, subscribe. Not for me, but for the voices that never made it back to tell theirs. The attack began before dawn, in that thick, frozen silence that tricks you into thinking maybe the worst has passed. Jennings had just handed me a tin of cold beans when we heard it, a low hum rolling through the trees like distant thunder, but heavier, deliberate. Then the ground began to tremble, not from shells this time, but from engines, big ones, Panzers. The sound grew until it was everywhere, echoing off the forest like the breath of some iron beast. We froze, every man in his hole gripping his rifle like it was part of his body. Then came the crack of a flare cutting through the fog, red light spilling across the snow. It painted the trees blood red, and in that glow, I saw them. Dark figures moving in a line, rifles raised, their helmets white with frost. They were coming straight for us. Jennings whispered something I didn't catch, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse before opening fire. The forest erupted all at once. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, all breaking the silence in one furious instant. The Germans fired back, the air thick with bullets that snapped past your ears like angry hornets. I felt the heat of one pass so close it burned my cheek. Snow exploded around us as men shouted, cried, fell. Peters was hit first, a shot through the shoulder. He dropped without a sound, and I pulled him back into the hole, pressing my hand to the wound, feeling the hot blood soak through my glove. "Stay with me," I said, but his eyes were already glassy. The medic crawled over, slid beside us, and did what he could. It wasn't much. The tanks came next, slow and unstoppable, their treads grinding the earth to pulp. They crushed the trees like matchsticks, shells spitting from their barrels, each one lighting up the forest like a camera flash from hell. One of them hit our left flank, and the whole line shuddered. Men scattered, trying to regroup, but every step sank into waist-deep snow. You couldn't run fast. You couldn't even hide. It was like fighting inside a dream where every movement drags you deeper into quicksand. I fired until the rifle steamed in my hands, until I couldn't feel my fingers, until my ears were ringing with the sound of metal and screams. The smell of gunpowder and blood, mixed with the sharp tang of pine, the kind of smell that never leaves you. We held for hours, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning out. The general had ordered artillery support from the next ridge, but communication was down again, so we fought blind. Jennings took a grenade, pulled the pin, and waited until the tank was 20 yards out before tossing it under the treads. The explosion threw him backward. I crawled to him, found him half buried in snow, coughing blood but still grinning like a lunatic. "Told you I'd get one," he said. I laughed, actually laughed, even as everything around us burned. That's what madness looks like. You stop trying to make sense of it. You just keep pulling the trigger because the moment you stop, the world stops with you. When the first assault finally broke, we were half deaf, half dead, and fully surrounded by silence again. Smoke hung low between the trees, and the snow was no longer white. It was red, brown, grey. Bodies everywhere, ours, theirs, tangled together like one long line of sacrifice. I remember crawling to what used to be our line and realizing it was gone, just churned mud and wreckage. The general arrived an hour later, walking through the wreckage like a man inspecting his own tomb. He didn't speak for a long time, just looked at those who were left, with an expression I'll never forget. Not pity, not pride, just weight, the kind that presses a man down from the inside. Then he said quietly, "You did what was asked. Now we hold again, hold again." That's what we did. All that day, all that night, through shellfire and frostbite, through screams that never seemed to stop echoing. We took turns sleeping for minutes at a time, rifles still in hand, helmets frozen to our heads. When I closed my eyes, I saw faces, Miller, Peters, boys from other units we'd never even known the names of, and I'd jolt awake, gasping, because every sound felt like the next attack. The Germans came again at dusk, smaller groups this time, probing, testing. We repelled them, but it cost us. We were running out of ammo. Some of the men started scavenging from the dead, stripping rifles, searching pockets for clips. Jennings handed me his last grenade and said, "For when they get too close." I didn't ask what he meant. We both knew. That night, a storm hit, the kind that blinds you, deafens you, buries everything. The snow fell so hard we couldn't see our own boots. The cold sank deep into our bones, and the dead froze where they lay, arms outstretched, faces turned skyward like they were praying to be buried. Somewhere in the middle of that white madness, I thought I saw movement again, shapes in the fog, shifting, advancing. I raised my rifle, finger on the trigger, heart hammering. Then a voice came out of the dark, English, hoarse, desperate. "Don't shoot, it's us!" Reinforcements, a handful of them, maybe a dozen men from another unit who'd gotten lost and stumbled into our position. They brought word from the general's HQ. His plan was working. The enemy had overcommitted, spread too thin. The risk he'd taken, staying put, digging in instead of retreating, was slowing the German advance. Bastogne was still holding. We were too tired to celebrate, too broken to believe, but inside something shifted, maybe hope, or maybe just the faint spark of survival that refuses to die no matter how much the world tries to crush it. I looked at Jennings, half asleep against the wall of our foxhole, frost clinging to his eyelashes, and said, "Maybe the old man was right after all." He smiled without opening his eyes. He better be. The next morning, the forest was quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after everything living has gone. I walked through what was left of our line, past the frozen bodies, past the wrecked tank still smouldering, and looked toward the road we'd been told to protect. It was still ours. Somehow, against every law of reason, we were still there. The general's risk had held, and in that moment, I realized sometimes the difference between bravery and suicide is just whether it works. The days that followed felt like one long night. No sun, no warmth, just the endless hum of engines somewhere beyond the mist and the quiet breathing of men too cold to speak. Our world had shrunk to a few hundred yards of forest and ice. The smell of smoke never left. It clung to our clothes, our skin, our thoughts. When you live that long under bombardment, your mind starts to twist. You hear things that aren't there, voices, footsteps, whispers carried by the wind. I remember waking once to the sound of laughter, faint and soft, and for a heartbeat I thought I was home again. Then the next shell landed, and I remembered where I was. The Germans didn't stop. They circled us like wolves, cutting off supply lines, shelling us every few hours, probing for weakness. We'd become a pocket, an island surrounded by fire. The general's risk had worked, yes, but at a price none of us could yet measure. We were holding the road, but barely. Every man was down to half rations, then quarter. The wounded moaned quietly in their holes, wrapped in blankets that froze solid. Jennings was limping from shrapnel in his thigh, but still refused to see the medic. "He'll just cut my pants open and freeze me faster," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. At night, we burned scraps of wood, maps, anything that would catch, just to feel something other than the cold. The snow glowed faintly orange in those small fires, lighting our faces in the dark, like ghosts staring back at themselves. On the 5th day, the general himself came forward again, walking through the shelling as if it didn't exist. He stopped by our foxhole and crouched down. His face looked carved from the same frozen earth we were lying in. He told us reinforcements were on the move. Patton's Third Army was pushing north, fast, but we had to hold just a little longer. A little longer. He said it like it was a simple thing, like time could be bent by willpower alone. I looked at him, this man who seemed immune to fear, and wondered if he'd forgotten what it was like to be human. Then he reached out, rested his hand on my shoulder, and said quietly, "You've done more than anyone has a right to ask. But if we break now, everything we've lost means nothing." And for the first time, I saw it. The exhaustion behind his eyes, the tremor in his hand. He wasn't unbreakable. He was just as scared as we were. That's what kept me going. That's what kept all of us going. That night, they came again. We heard the mortars first, distant, steady, rhythmic. Then the whine of shells overhead. The ground erupted. Snow turned to fire. Foxholes collapsed. Trees splintered into spears. Jennings shouted something I couldn't hear and disappeared into smoke. I grabbed my rifle and fired blind into the dark, my vision flashing white with every explosion. The sound was beyond sound, a roar that lived inside your skull. When the smoke cleared for a heartbeat, I saw them, silhouettes moving fast, crawling, running, firing. They were closer than ever before, maybe 50 yards. I could see the shine of their helmets, the steam of their breath. I fired again, until my rifle clicked empty. I reloaded with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The line was folding. Men were shouting for ammo, for medics, for God. A flamethrower burst somewhere on the left flank, the fire rolling over snow like a wave of molten orange. I saw 2 men go up in flames, one screaming, one silent. The smell was worse than death. I'll never forget it. I crawled toward Jennings' position, but his hole was gone, filled with smoke and rubble. My heart stopped. I shouted his name. Nothing. I shouted again, my throat raw. But the only answer was another explosion that threw me backward into the snow. I hit hard, my head ringing, my mouth full of dirt and blood. For a moment, everything went quiet, not peaceful, just muffled, like the world had been drowned underwater. I looked up and saw the sky glowing orange through the smoke. Then I realized it wasn't the sky, it was Bastogne, burning. I don't know how long I lay there before someone dragged me up. It was Peter's replacement, a kid whose name I never learned. He was yelling that the general was calling a fallback, a shift to secondary positions deeper in the woods. I followed, stumbling, half blind, past the wounded, past the bodies that already looked like part of the earth. When we reached the new line, the general was there, calm as ever, directing what was left of us. Maybe 50 men, maybe less. He pointed to the road behind him, that same damn road we'd been told to die for, and said, "They can't have it, simple as that." His coat was torn. One side burned black, but his eyes were sharp. He stood there as shells landed around him, his voice steady, and somehow, the men believed again. I did too. We dug in again. Every shovelful of earth felt like an act of defiance. Every bullet we loaded felt personal. When the next assault came, we met it head on. We fired until our barrels glowed, until our shoulders bruised, until there was nothing left in us but stubbornness. The Germans came in waves, shouting, firing, slipping on the frozen ground. I remember one of them breaking through. A boy, no older than 17, running at me with his rifle raised. I fired, but the gun jammed. He tripped before he reached me, falling face first into the snow. I looked at him lying there, his hands twitching, and I saw the photo sticking out of his coat pocket. A girl smiling. I wanted to hate him. I couldn't. We were both just trapped in the same nightmare. When dawn came, we were still alive, barely. The forest looked like the end of the world. Black smoke, shattered trees, snow turned to mud and blood. Jennings was there after, limping, face pale, but alive. He sat beside me, lit a cigarette with trembling hands, and passed it over. "We did it," he said, voice hoarse. "We actually held." I looked around, at the wreckage, at the faces of men who'd given everything, and I wasn't sure if holding was the right word. But we'd survived, and that counted for something. The general came by once more before nightfall. He looked at us, the remnants, and nodded. "You've done your duty," he said simply. "No one will forget this." But we all knew most people would. That's how war works. The world remembers victory, not the men who froze in the mud to make them possible. Still, when he walked away, something in me shifted. Maybe pride, maybe disbelief, maybe both. And now I want to ask you something real. Have you ever had to hold on to something when every part of you wanted to give up? Have you ever fought for something even when you thought it would destroy you? If you have, write it in the comments right now. Write, "I know what it means to hold the line." When the shelling finally stopped for good, the silence felt wrong. It wasn't peace. It was emptiness. The kind that hums in your ears like a wound that won't close. The air was still thick with smoke, but the snow had started again, slow and steady, covering the wreckage like the earth itself was trying to forget. We didn't cheer. We didn't even talk. The living just moved among the dead, searching for whoever was left. Some of the bodies were frozen in mid-crawl, faces twisted toward a light that never came. I remember stepping over a rifle half buried in ice, its barrel pointing upward like a question no one would ever answer. The battle had ended, they said, but standing there, I couldn't tell the difference between victory and survival. Jennings and I found a bit of shelter under what used to be a barn. The roof had collapsed on one side, but it blocked the wind. We started a small fire with bits of broken wood and an old map we'd stopped needing weeks ago. The flames barely rose, just flickered weakly, like they were as tired as we were. We sat there for hours without speaking, our faces orange in the glow, our minds somewhere else entirely. At some point, I realized I couldn't remember what day it was. Maybe it didn't matter. Time had stretched and broken. The hours blended together like water freezing into glass. All I could think about was warmth, the kind that doesn't come from fire, but from life itself. The sound of my mother's radio, the creak of the porch at home, the laughter of someone safe. The general came by that night. He didn't say much, just told us we'd held the road long enough for Patton's tanks to break through. Bastogne was still standing. We had done our part. He looked older than he had before, his face drawn and grey, his eyes hollow. The risk had paid off, but it had cost him something too, maybe more than he'd ever admit. When he walked away, his steps were slow, heavy, like each one took effort. I wondered if he'd ever forgive himself for all the men buried out there in the frozen woods. I wondered if I ever would. The medics started collecting the wounded the next morning. Some were carried on stretchers, some just walked, limping, heads down, like men too embarrassed to still be alive. Jennings was one of them. His leg was worse, the shrapnel festering under the bandages. I watched them load him onto a truck, one of the few that still ran, and he gave me a weak grin. "You'll catch up." I nodded, but I didn't believe it. I never saw him again after that. I like to think he made it home. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. The war had a way of swallowing names and spitting out ghosts. When the last truck rolled out, I stayed behind with a few others to help clear what was left of our position. We dug through snow and debris, pulling out weapons, ammunition, dog tags. Sometimes we found faces we recognized, sometimes just pieces. Every item felt personal. A glove with initials burned into the leather, a photograph stiff with frost, a wife, a child, a house somewhere that still had light in the window. I kept one of the tags I found that, not because I knew the man, but because I couldn't stand the thought of him being forgotten. I still have it. Some nights, I take it out, run my fingers over the metal, and wonder who he was. That night, when the fires had burned low and the wind had gone quiet, I sat alone and tried to understand what it all meant. They said we'd turned the tide, that the Battle of the Bulge had broken the German advance, that the war was changing course, but none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was that I was still breathing, and I couldn't figure out why. The guilt of it, of being one of the ones who lived, it's something you don't expect. You think you'll feel lucky, but instead, you feel like the world made a mistake, like you owe something you'll never be able to repay. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. Miller, Peters, the kid from Oklahoma, the boy in the snow with the photograph of his sister. Their eyes followed me through the dark. The sounds came back too. The whistle of shells, the screams, the roar of engines. It's strange how silence can be louder than any explosion when your head is full of ghosts. I sat up until dawn, staring at the dim light creeping over the hills, and thought about what the general had said, that if we fell, others would die, but if we held, it would matter. I wondered if it really did. War teaches you that meaning isn't something given, it's something you have to carve out of the chaos. Maybe that's what his risk was really about. Not strategy, not victory, just belief. Belief that something could still be worth dying for when everything else had already burned away. And in a strange way, I think that's what kept me alive. Not hope, not courage, just the refusal to let it all be for nothing. When the war finally ended, it didn't feel like an ending at all. There was no great moment, no thunderous relief, just the slow realization that the noise had stopped and we were still breathing. I remember standing in a field outside Bastogne months later, long after the front had moved east, staring at the road we'd bled for. The snow had melted, the trees were green again, and wildflowers were pushing through the soil where men had died. It felt wrong, like the earth was trying to cover up what it had seen. I walked along the line where our foxholes used to be and found pieces of helmets, fragments of rifle, even a rusted canteen with initials scratched into it. The forest was quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt haunted. Every sound, a bird, a rustle of wind, carried an echo of that winter. It was as if the ground remembered us, even if the world didn't. They sent us home in waves, one train after another, filled with boys who no longer looked like boys. We sat in silence most of the time, staring out at the countryside rolling by, the same land we'd fought for, now calm and whole again. Some men talked about home, about girls they hadn't seen in years, about plans for jobs and families. I listened, but I didn't have words of my own. It's strange. When you've lived that close to death, the idea of living again feels impossible. You start to wonder what kind of person walks out of that kind of storm and still knows how to laugh. When the train reached the coast, we boarded a ship back to the States. The sea was rough, grey, and endless. I stood on deck most nights, watching the horizon. It was the first time in years I'd seen open water without thinking of invasion. The wind was cold, but clean. It smelled of salt, not smoke. I remember thinking maybe that was what freedom was supposed to feel like. Cold, quiet, uncertain. Home wasn't what I remembered. The streets were clean, the lights warm, the people smiling, but everything felt smaller, quieter, as if the world had shrunk to fit inside a frame I no longer belonged to. My mother hugged me so hard I thought my ribs might crack. My father just nodded, eyes wet, and said he was proud. Proud. I smiled back, but it felt hollow. How do you explain to someone what pride costs when they've never heard the sound of a man dying beside them? How do you tell them that the hardest part of war isn't leaving, it's coming back? You can't. You just nod. You say thank you, and you sit at the dinner table pretending the sound of the fork on the plate doesn't make you flinch. Nights were the worst. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there. The snow, the fire, the screaming. Sometimes I woke up gasping, heart pounding, the smell of smoke in my nose even though there was nothing burning. I started keeping a light on, small, dim, just enough to remind me I was home. My mother thought it was because I hated the dark. I didn't tell her it was because I didn't trust silence anymore. During the day, I tried to keep busy. Small jobs, odd work, but my hands would tremble whenever I heard a car backfire or the distant crack of thunder. Once, a kid in the neighborhood dropped a metal trash can lid, and I hit the ground before I even knew what I was doing. He laughed, didn't understand. How could he? I got letters from a few of the guys who made it out. Some were doing fine, or at least pretending to be. Jennings wrote from a hospital in New York, said his leg was gone, but he was learning to walk again. He joked that he'd finally have an excuse to get out of dancing. The letter was signed with shaky handwriting. but it felt like him, still cracking jokes even after the world had taken so much. I wrote back, but the words came slow. What could I say that didn't sound like another goodbye? Miller's family sent a photograph of his grave, neat and perfect, the grass already growing over. They wrote to thank me for being his friend. I stared at that letter for an hour, trying to remember what friendship even meant after everything we'd seen. Sometimes I'd walk to the edge of town, to the old train station, and just sit there watching people come and go. I liked the sound of it, the whistle, the clatter, because it reminded me that the world was still moving forward, even if I wasn't. There's something cruel about how easily life forgets war. The papers move on, the parades fade, and the faces of the fallen turn into names on stone. But for those of us who carried the weight, forgetting was never an option. The war didn't end for us, it just changed shape. It lived in the space between breaths, in the silence before sleep. People called us heroes, they still do sometimes, but I've never liked that word. Heroes don't flinch when doors slam. Heroes don't wake up in the middle of the night, calling names that no one answers. We were just men who didn't have a choice. Men who stood where we were told to stand and held on until there was nothing left to hold. Maybe that's all heroism really is. Doing what has to be done, even when you're terrified. I used to think survival meant beating death. Now I know it means learning to live with it. And if there's one thing I learned in those frozen woods, it's that living can be harder than dying. It's been years now, decades even, since that winter in the Ardennes, but the memories haven't aged a day. They live inside me, clear as the cold breath that hung in the air that morning before the first shell fell. Sometimes I think memory is its own kind of battle, the fight between what you remember, you can stand to remember. The doctors call it trauma, but that word feels too clean. What it really is a shadow that never leaves. You learn to live alongside it, to build your days around it. You learn how to smile again, how to laugh, how to hold someone close without thinking of the faces you lost. But it's always there, waiting in the quiet moments when the world slows down. I still dream of the general sometimes. In my mind, he's standing in that snow-covered field again, his map spread over a table, his voice calm, his eyes steady. He tells me we did what had to be done, that the risk was worth it. I want to believe him. Maybe he's right. His plan saved us, saved Bastogne, maybe even the war. But when I think of all the faces buried in that frozen ground, I can't help but wonder if survival ever truly counts as victory. Some nights, I wake up and look out the window at the stars, and I think about those men. How many never got to see another sky? How many still lie beneath the soil of that foreign forest? The world moved on, the seasons changed, but part of me stayed there. Maybe the best part. After the war, people asked me what it felt like to fight, to win, to come home. I never knew how to answer. How do you explain to someone that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving, even when you're already broken? That the hardest thing isn't pulling the trigger, but living with the sound after? I used to think there was something noble in it, something that separated soldiers from everyone else. But over time, I realized the truth. It's not war that defines a man, it's what he does after, how he chooses to carry the weight, how he finds meaning in the ruins. I've tried to live quietly, married once, lost her too soon, worked odd jobs, kept to myself. Some people said I was lucky, that I came home in one piece, but that's not really true. None of us came home whole. We brought the war with us, in our bones, our dreams, our silences. Every now and then, I still feel that December wind on my face, and I swear I can smell the smoke again, hear the faint thrum of engines in the distance, but it doesn't scare me anymore. It just reminds me of who we were, young, terrified, unprepared, but somehow still standing. We weren't heroes, we were survivors, and that's enough. Sometimes, when I walk through the park in the early morning and see the frost on the grass, I think of the Ardennes. The way the snow caught the light even in the darkest days, the way the cold bit into you but kept you awake, alive. There was beauty, even there, in the horror, a strange, cruel kind of beauty that only those who lived it can understand. I think that's what keeps me telling the story, even now. Not to glorify it, not to relive it, but to remember. Because forgetting is the last death, and I owe it to the ones who didn't come back to keep their memory alive. If you've listened this far, if you've walked through this story with me, I want to thank you. Maybe you've never worn a uniform. Maybe you've never seen war. I hope you never do. But everyone, in some way, has fought their own battle. Maybe that's why these stories still matter. Because they're not just about war, they're about endurance, about the small, quiet decision to keep living when everything else is gone. So before I end this, I want to leave you with something simple. When you wake up tomorrow, take a moment to breathe the morning air, to look at the light breaking over the horizon, And remember that peace, real peace, is never free. It's built on the shoulders of those who carried the risk, the ones who stood their ground so that others could move forward, the ones who never came home. And if this story meant something, if it made you stop for a moment, or remember someone, or feel something, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Not for me, for them, for all of us who still remember the cold and the road we never stopped holding.